The silence of the Wyoming sunset was broken only by the low whistling of James O'Malley as he sat on his porch, watching his twin boys chase each other around the yard of their modest ranch. The year was 1878, and for 3 years now James had been raising his 6-year-old sons alone, convinced that was how things would and should remain. "Pa, Billy got mud on my boots again," shouted Thomas, the younger twin by 4 minutes. "Did not, you stepped in it yourself." Billy retorted, his freckled face flushed with indignation. James sighed, running a weathered hand through his sandy brown hair. At 32, he felt twice his age most days. The 00 Ranch wasn't much, but it was their 60 acres of decent grazing land with a sturdy 2-bedroom cabin that James had built himself when he'd first arrived in Wyoming territory 5 years ago with his young bride. "Both of you wash up at the pump before supper," James called out, rising from his chair with a groan. His bones ached from a long day of mending fences and moving cattle to the south pasture. "And no more arguing, or there'll be no story before bed." The threat of no bedtime story was enough to silence the boys immediately. James smiled to himself as he walked into the cabin to check on the stew he'd left simmering. Cooking wasn't his strong suit, but he'd learned to manage simple meals since Sarah had passed. Pneumonia had taken her quickly 3 winters ago, leaving him alone with 2 3-year-old boys and a ranch that demanded constant attention. As James stirred the pot of stew, the sound of hoofbeats approached from the road. Visitors were rare at the 00, especially this close to sundown. He wiped his hands on a rag and stepped back onto the porch just as a wagon pulled up to his hitching post. "Evening," called a man James recognized as Elijah Cooper, one of the town's councilmen. "Got a minute, O'Malley?" James nodded, noticing the woman sitting beside Cooper on the wagon bench. She was perhaps in her mid-20s, with auburn hair peeking out from beneath a modest bonnet. Her dress, though simple, was clean and well-made. "Boys, keep washing up," James instructed before walking to the wagon. "What brings you out this way, Cooper?" "This here is Miss Nora Bellamy," Cooper said, gesturing to the woman. "Just arrived on yesterday's stage from Boston. She's the schoolteacher the town council's been trying to hire." The woman nodded politely at James. "Mr. O'Malley." "Miss," James replied with a curt nod. "Thing is," Cooper continued, "the teacherage ain't ready yet. Roof's still being fixed after that storm last month and won't be done for another 2 weeks at least. Town council's been finding places for Miss Bellamy to stay until then." James immediately knew where this was heading and felt his jaw tighten. "I'm sure the widow Hanson would be happy to take her in." "Widow Hanson's got her daughter and 3 grandchildren visiting from Cheyenne," Cooper explained. "Everyone else in town is either too crowded or well." He cleared his throat. "Not appropriate for a single lady. And you think my place is?" James asked incredulously. Cooper shifted uncomfortably. "You've got the extra bedroom since your housekeeper left, and those boys of yours could use some civilizing influence." "It's just for 2 weeks, O'Malley." "I don't need Mr. Cooper," Nora Bellamy interjected, her voice firm but gentle. "I can see Mr. O'Malley isn't comfortable with the arrangement. Perhaps we should—" "Pa," Billy came running up, Thomas close behind. "Are you getting us a new ma?" James felt his face grow hot with embarrassment. "No, son, this is just Miss Bellamy. She's going to be the new schoolteacher in town." "But where's she going to sleep?" Thomas asked, peering up at the wagon. "Not here," James said firmly. "She'll be staying with someone else in town." "But Pa," Billy protested, "we got the empty room where Mrs. Jenkins used to sleep before she went to live with her daughter. And you said yourself the house needs a woman's touch." James wanted to sink into the ground. He'd muttered those words just last week when he'd burned their supper for the 3rd time that month. Miss Bellamy climbed down from the wagon with surprising grace, smoothing her skirts before addressing the twins directly. "You must be Billy and Thomas. Mr. Cooper told me about you on the ride over. I hear you're both quite clever boys." The twins puffed up with pride, and James could see them falling under her spell instantly. She had striking green eyes, he noticed, and a gentle way of speaking that seemed to command attention without demanding it. "Miss Bellamy is looking for a place to stay for just a short while," Cooper explained to the boys, "until her house in town is ready. She can have Mrs. Jenkins' old room." Thomas exclaimed, "Can't she, Pa? She can have supper with us and everything. And maybe she can help with our letters," Billy added eagerly. "Pa tries, but he's not very good at teaching." James shot his son a betrayed look. "I do just fine with your lessons." "You fell asleep last time, Pa," Thomas reminded him. Cooper poorly disguised his laugh as a cough, and even Miss Bellamy's lips twitched with amusement. James looked from his hopeful sons to the patient schoolteacher and back to Cooper. He knew he was beaten. 2 weeks, he said firmly. "Not a day more," Cooper beamed. "I knew you'd come through, O'Malley. I'll have Miss Bellamy's trunks sent over tomorrow." As Cooper drove away, leaving Miss Bellamy standing in his yard with a small carpet bag, James had the distinct feeling that his carefully ordered life was about to be upended. "I promise I won't be a burden, Mr. O'Malley," Miss Bellamy said once Cooper was out of earshot. "I can cook and help with the boys' lessons. I understand this is an imposition." "It's just temporary," James replied gruffly. "The boy's mother has been gone 3 years now. We manage fine on our own." Something flickered in her green eyes, pity, perhaps, or understanding. Either way, it made James uncomfortable. "Of course," she said simply. "I'll respect your household and your ways." Billy tugged at her skirt. "Can you make apple pie, Mrs.?" "Jenkins used to make apple pie, but Pa can't make the crust right." "William," James admonished. Miss Bellamy smiled down at the boy. "I do know how to make apple pie. Perhaps, if your father approves, I could bake one while I'm here." Both boys turned to James with pleading eyes. He sighed and gestured toward the house. "Supper's nearly ready, it's just stew." "Stew sounds wonderful," Miss Bellamy said, following them inside. The cabin was modest but solidly built. The main room served as both kitchen and living space, with a stone fireplace at one end and a sturdy table with 4 chairs in the center. A doorway led to the boys' room and another to what had once been James and Sarah's room. The small 3rd bedroom, which had housed Mrs. Jenkins during her brief stay as housekeeper, was little more than a storage space now. "I'll need to clear out some things," James said, opening the door to reveal crates of tools and winter clothing. "I'm happy to help," Miss Bellamy offered. "No need." "Boys, show Miss Bellamy where to wash up while I get this room sorted." As the boys eagerly led their guest outside to the washing pump, James took a moment to collect himself. The last woman to sleep under his roof had been Sarah. Having this stranger here felt like a betrayal somehow, though he knew that was foolish. Miss Bellamy wasn't replacing anyone. She was merely a temporary guest thrust upon him by circumstance and his son's eagerness. By the time they returned, James had moved most of the storage items to the small lean-to behind the house. The room now contained a narrow bed with fresh linens, a small dresser, and a washstand. "It's not much," he said apologetically as Miss Bellamy inspected her temporary quarters. "It's perfect, Mr. O'Malley. Thank you." Supper was a livelier affair than the O'Malley household had seen in months. The boys peppered Miss Bellamy with questions about Boston and her journey west, while she patiently answered each one and asked questions of her own about their lives on the ranch. "Do you have any family out here, Miss Bellamy?" James found himself asking as they ate. She shook her head. "No, sir. My parents passed some years ago and my older brother was lost at Gettysburg. I was teaching at a girls' school in Boston, but when I saw the advertisement for a schoolteacher in Wyoming territory, something in me just wanted the adventure, I suppose." "Wyoming's a hard place for a woman alone," James commented. "Most places are hard for a woman alone, Mr. O'Malley," she replied evenly. "At least here I'll be doing something meaningful." After supper, while James cleaned up, Miss Bellamy asked if she might look at the boys' schoolbooks. Soon, she was seated at the table with Billy and Thomas, gently correcting their letters and showing them new words. James watched surreptitiously as he dried the dishes, noting how patient she was when Thomas struggled with a difficult word and how she praised Billy's neat penmanship. When it was time for bed, the boys insisted Miss Bellamy listen to their prayers and then begged for a story. "Your father might have a story planned," she demurred. "Pa always tells the same ones," Billy said, "about cowboys and Indians or the war." "I'd like to hear one of your stories, if you don't mind," James found himself saying. Miss Bellamy smiled, and for the first time that evening, James noticed how it transformed her face, bringing a warmth to her features that he found unexpectedly appealing. Very well. Have you boys ever heard the story of Paul Bunyan and his blue ox, Babe? The next morning, James woke before dawn as usual. He dressed quietly and went to check on the boys before heading out to start his chores. To his surprise, a light was already burning in the kitchen and the smell of coffee filled the cabin. Miss Bellamy stood at the stove, her hair braided down her back, already dressed for the day in a simple blue calico dress. "You're up early," James commented. She turned, seemingly unsurprised by his presence. "I thought I'd make breakfast before you had to leave for your chores. There's coffee ready." James accepted the cup she offered, taken aback by this small kindness. Mrs. Jenkins, during her 3-month stay, had never risen before the sun. "Thank you, but you didn't need to do that. I'm used to early mornings. At the school in Boston, we began at 7 sharp. James sipped the coffee. It was stronger than he usually made it, and better. "The boys won't be up for another hour." "Then you'll have a hot breakfast waiting when you come in from the morning chores," she said practically, turning back to the stove where she was mixing biscuit dough. Without another word, James headed out to the barn. As he milked the cow and fed the livestock, he found himself distracted by thoughts of the schoolteacher in his kitchen. It had been so long since anyone had made coffee for him or thought to have breakfast waiting when he returned from chores. These small considerations, which had once been part of his daily life with Sarah, now felt like unexpected luxuries. When he returned to the cabin, the boys were up and dressed, setting the table under Miss Bellamy's direction. The smell of bacon and biscuits filled the room. "Look, Pa." "Miss Nora showed us how to fold the napkins proper," Thomas said proudly. "Miss Nora," James raised an eyebrow. "I hope you don't mind," Miss Bellamy said. Miss Bellamy seemed too formal for everyday use around the house, but if you prefer, no, it's fine. He hung his hat on the peg by the door. "Just surprised me. Breakfast was hearty and delicious. The biscuits were lighter than any James had managed since Sarah died, and the boys ate with enthusiasm, asking for seconds. "What will you do today, Miss Nora?" James asked as they finished eating. "I thought I might do some baking, if you don't mind. The boys mentioned they miss pie, and I saw you have some preserved apples in the pantry. And perhaps we could continue with the boys' lessons this afternoon. Pa, can we stay home from town today and have lessons with Miss Nora instead?" Billy pleaded. James had planned to take the boys into Timber Creek with him while he picked up supplies, as he did every Saturday. "Miss Nora might want some time to settle in," he said cautiously. "I don't mind at all," she assured him. "In fact, I'd welcome the chance to assess where they are in their studies before school starts." And so it was decided. James would go to town alone, leaving Miss Bellamy with his sons for the day. As he hitched up the wagon, he found himself giving her unnecessary instructions about the boys' routine and what to do in case of emergencies. "Mr. O'Malley," she interrupted gently, "we'll be fine. I've managed classrooms with 30 children. I think I can handle 2 well-behaved boys for a few hours." He nodded, feeling foolish. "Of course, I'll be back by mid-afternoon." In town, James found himself rushing through his errands, eager to return home. When Mr. Patterson at the Mercantile asked about Miss Bellamy, James was surprised by his own defensive response. "She seems competent enough, good with the boys." "Lucky she landed with you," Patterson commented as he measured out flour. "Half the men in town would have been fighting for the chance to host a pretty young schoolteacher like her." James frowned. "It's a temporary arrangement, nothing more." Patterson just smiled knowingly as he wrapped James's purchases. At the post office, James collected a letter from Sarah's sister in Ohio, who wrote monthly asking if she could take the boys to raise properly, with a woman's influence. He stuffed the letter in his pocket without opening it. The answer was always the same. The boys belonged with him on the land that would someday be theirs. By the time James started for home, dark clouds were gathering on the horizon. He pushed the horses harder, hoping to beat the rain. He was within sight of the ranch when the skies opened up. By the time he pulled the wagon under the shelter beside the barn, he was soaked through. He hurried to the house, surprised to find it filled with warmth and light despite the gloomy afternoon. The smell of baking filled the air, and the sound of laughter came from the boys' room. "I'm back," he called, shaking water from his hat. The boys tumbled out of their room, faces alight with excitement. "Pa, Miss Nora taught us a new game with cards where you have to make pairs, and she showed us how to write our whole names in cursive, and she's baking 2 pies." James looked past them to where Nora stood in the kitchen doorway, wiping her hands on an apron that must have been Sarah's. She'd pinned her hair up, but tendrils had escaped to frame her face, flushed from the heat of the oven. "Welcome back," she said. "You're soaked through." "There's hot water if you want to change." James felt a strange tightness in his chest at her simple concern. "I'll just hang my coat by the fire. How were they?" he asked, nodding toward the twins. "Angels," she replied with a smile. "We had a good day of lessons, and they helped me pick some late berries for the second pie." 2 pies, James raised an eyebrow. The boys were very persuasive. That evening, after a supper of beef stew, improved significantly by Nora's additions of herbs and vegetables from James's neglected garden, and the promised apple pie, James found himself sitting contentedly by the fire while Nora read to the boys from a book of fairy tales she'd brought with her. When the twins were finally tucked into bed, Nora returned to the main room where James sat mending a bridle. "They're wonderful boys, Mr. O'Malley," she said softly, taking a seat across from him. "You've done a fine job with them." "James," he said suddenly. "If the boys are calling you Nora, you might as well call me James." She nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "James, then? And thank you, they're good boys, but they miss having a mother. Mrs. Jenkins was here for a few months last year, but she was older and not very patient with them." "May I ask what happened to their mother?" Nora inquired gently. "Sarah caught pneumonia 3 winters ago. She was gone within a week." Even after 3 years, the words still burned in his throat. The boys were only 3. They don't remember her much now. "I'm sorry for your loss," Nora said, her voice full of genuine sympathy. "It must have been very difficult." "We managed," James said stiffly, uncomfortable with her compassion. "What about you? What brings a Boston schoolteacher all the way to Wyoming territory?" Nora was quiet for a moment, her hands folded in her lap. "After my brother died at Gettysburg, my parents seemed to just fade away. Father first, then mother 2 years later. I kept teaching at the girls' school, but it felt like I was just going through the motions. When I saw the advertisement for a teacher needed in Wyoming, something inside me said it was time for a change." She looked up at him with a small smile. "Perhaps I was running away, or perhaps I was running toward something new. Wyoming's not an easy place," James warned. "Few worthwhile things are easy," she replied. Over the next few days, a routine developed in the O'Malley household. James would rise early for chores, returning to find breakfast waiting. After they ate, he would work around the ranch while Nora conducted lessons with the boys. In the afternoons, Billy and Thomas would help their father with simple tasks while Nora tended to household matters. In the evenings, they would gather by the fire, the boys often begging for stories or help with their reading. On the 4th day, James returned from repairing a distant fence line to find Nora in the garden, a basket of vegetables beside her as she pulled weeds from between the rows of carrots and beans. "You don't need to do that," he said, dismounting from his horse. She looked up, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. "I don't mind. The garden was being overtaken, and it seemed a shame to waste the harvest." James looked at the neat rows where weeds had been choking the vegetables just days before. "Sarah planted this garden," he said quietly. "I haven't kept it up like I should." Nora stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. She must have been very skilled. The layout is perfect for this climate. She grew up on a farm in Ohio, knew all about growing things. James hesitated, then added, "She would have liked that you're tending it." Something softened in Nora's expression. "Thank you for saying that." That night at supper, they ate fresh vegetables from the garden, cooked in a way that made even the boys clean their plates without complaint. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" James asked as he helped her clear the table while the boys worked on a map Nora had assigned them to draw. "My mother believed every woman should know how to manage a household, regardless of her other pursuits. She insisted I learn cooking alongside Latin and mathematics." Nora smiled at the memory. "I resented it at the time, but I'm grateful now." The boys are too, James said, watching as Billy carefully labeled their map of Wyoming territory. They've learned more from you in 4 days than they did from me in months. You've had other priorities, Nora said kindly. Running a ranch and raising children alone is more than most could manage. Still, I'm glad they're getting proper lessons now, James admitted. What will happen when I move to the teacherage? Nora asked quietly. They'll only have school 5 days a week, and not for full days at first while we get established. James hadn't allowed himself to think about Nora's inevitable departure. The boys had blossomed under her attention, and if he was honest with himself, he'd grown accustomed to her presence as well, the soft sound of her humming as she worked, the way she anticipated needs before they were spoken, the gentle authority with which she managed his sons without undermining his own. I suppose we'll go back to how things were, he said finally, though the prospect no longer seemed as simple as it once had. The next day, a Sunday, James suggested they might all attend church in town. Nora had been at the ranch for nearly a week and had yet to meet most of the townspeople who would be sending their children to her school. That's a wonderful idea, she agreed. I should meet the community before classes begin. The boys, who usually complained about having to sit still through the service, were eager to show off their Miss Nora. They wore their best shirts without protest and allowed her to tame their unruly hair with water and a comb. James found himself paying unusual attention to his own appearance, trimming his beard neatly and choosing his good suit that had hung unworn in the wardrobe for months. When he emerged from his bedroom, he caught Nora looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read before she quickly turned away. She herself was a vision in a dove-gray dress with a white collar, her auburn hair arranged more elegantly than he'd seen during her stay at the ranch. For the first time, James truly saw what a beautiful woman she was, and the realization made him uncharacteristically nervous. The arrival of the O'Malleys with Miss Bellamy caused quite a stir at the small white church in Timber Creek. James was acutely aware of the interested glances and whispered conversations as he escorted Nora and the boys to a pew near the back. After the service, it seemed everyone in town wanted to meet the new schoolteacher. James stood awkwardly to the side as Nora charmed parents, introduced herself to future pupils, and fielded questions about her teaching methods. She handled the attention with grace, remembering names and details about each family she met. She's something, isn't she? Elijah Cooper said, sidling up to James. Half the unmarried men in town are already smitten, and most of the married ones wish they weren't. James frowned. She's a respectable woman here to teach, not to find a husband. Cooper raised an eyebrow, didn't say she was looking. Just observing that others are certainly looking at her. He clapped James on the shoulder. Good news, though, Ruth's nearly done on the teacherage. Another week at most, and she'll be settled in town where she belongs. The news, which should have been a relief, instead sent an unexpected pang through James. Good to hear, he said stiffly. On the ride home, the boys chatted excitedly about the children they'd met who would be their schoolmates, while Nora answered their questions about what school would be like. Will you still have supper with us sometimes? Thomas asked suddenly. After you moved to town, Nora glanced at James before answering carefully. That would be up to your father, Thomas. I'll be quite busy with school duties. But you could come on Sundays, couldn't you? Billy pressed. Pa could drive us to church, and then you could come home with us for Sunday dinner, like today. Boys, James intervened, Miss Nora will have her own life in town. She won't want to spend all her free time with us. Why not? Thomas demanded. Don't you like us? Of course I like you, Nora assured him quickly. Very much. But as your teacher, I'll need to be fair and not show favoritism. The boys fell silent, digesting this information. James could see they were disappointed, and truthfully, so was he. The past week with Nora had brought a lightness to their home that had been missing for 3 long years. That evening, after the boys were asleep, James found Nora sitting on the porch, gazing at the stars. He hesitated, then sat beside her on the bench. Thank you for today, she said softly. It was important for me to meet everyone before school begins. They all seemed impressed with you, James replied. Cooper says the teacherage will be ready in about a week. Oh, Nora's voice held a note of surprise or perhaps disappointment. That's good. I should start preparing my lessons in earnest. They sat in silence for a moment, the night sounds of the prairie surrounding them. The boys will miss you, James finally said. They've gotten attached. Nora turned to look at him, her face shadowed in the moonlight. Only the boys. The directness of her question caught James off guard. He cleared his throat, suddenly feeling like a schoolboy rather than a grown man. I've grown accustomed to your company as well, he admitted. The house was quieter before you came. Is quiet what you want, James? She asked softly. The question hung between them, weighted with meaning. James had convinced himself for 3 years that quiet was exactly what he wanted: a simple, uncompromised life raising his sons and working his land. But in just 1 week, Nora had shown him how empty that life had become. I don't know anymore, he answered honestly. For a long time, it seemed safer to want nothing but what I already had. Nora nodded, understanding in her eyes. When I came west, I told myself it was just for adventure, for a new start, but perhaps I was looking for something more too. And have you found it? James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She held his gaze steadily. I'm beginning to think I might have. The week that followed was both wonderful and painful for James. Wonderful because each day with Nora and the boys felt more natural, more right than the last. Painful because he knew it was temporary, that soon she would move to town and their daily life together would end. The boys grew increasingly anxious about Nora's impending departure. They clung to her more, insisted on extra stories at bedtime, and asked repeatedly when they would see her after she moved. You'll see Miss Nora every day at school, James reminded them as they sat at breakfast 6 days before she was due to leave. But it won't be the same, Billy protested. She won't be here for breakfast or supper, and she won't tuck us in. Miss Nora has a job to do, James said firmly. Teaching isn't just during school hours. She'll have lessons to prepare and papers to grade. But she could do that here, Thomas suggested. Couldn't she, Pa? She could live here and just go to the school to teach. James caught Nora's eye across the table and saw her cheeks flush. That's not how it works, son. The teacher lives in town close to the school. Why? Billy demanded. Mrs. Jenkins lived here and went into town to work at the hotel. That was different, James said, growing uncomfortable with the conversation. Why? Thomas echoed his brother. Is it because Miss Nora isn't our ma? Because she could be, couldn't she? If you married her, then she could stay forever. James nearly choked on his coffee. Thomas. That's not, you can't just, I think it's a fine idea, Billy declared. Don't you want to marry Pa, Miss Nora? Then you'd be our ma for real and you wouldn't have to leave. The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Nora's face was now bright red, and she seemed unable to meet James's eyes. Boys, she finally said gently, marriage is a very serious decision that grown-ups make after knowing each other for a long time. Your father and I have only known each other for a short while. But you like each other, Thomas insisted. We can tell. Pa smiles more when you're around, and he doesn't frown when you burn the toast like he did when we did it. And you laugh at Pa's stories even when they're not funny, Billy added. Just like Ma used to, Mrs. Jenkins said. James stood abruptly. That's enough. Both of you finish your breakfast and then get started on your chores. No more talk about this. The boys fell silent, but the damage was done. The easy companionship that had developed between James and Nora had been replaced by an awkward tension that lasted throughout the day. James found excuses to stay away from the house, working far out in the pasture until nearly supper time. When he returned, the boys were subdued, and Nora was quieter than usual as she served the meal she'd prepared. After the boys were in bed, James found her in the kitchen, washing the last of the dishes. I'm sorry about this morning, he said, leaning against the doorframe. The boys don't understand how inappropriate their suggestions were. Nora dried her hands on a towel, her back to him. They're children, James. They see a simple solution to what they perceive as a problem. Still, I want you to know that I would never presume. He stumbled over his words, frustrated with his own ineptitude. Nora turned to face him, her expression unreadable. Is it really so outlandish, what the boys suggested? James stared at her, caught off guard by her directness once again. We barely know each other, he said finally. We've lived in the same house for nearly 2 weeks, she countered. I've cooked your meals, taught your children, shared your table and your fire. I know that you take your coffee strong in the morning but weaker in the evening. I know you sing to yourself when you think no one can hear, usually old ballads from the war. I know you're a good father who wants the best for his sons, even when you're not sure what that is. Nora, and you know me too, she continued. You know I rise with the sun and prefer to read by lamplight rather than firelight. You know I'm patient with the boys but firm when they test boundaries. You know I miss my family but have made peace with their loss. She took a step toward him. I'm not saying the boys are right. I'm not asking you for marriage or promises. But I am asking if you felt what I've felt these past 2 weeks, that maybe we found something neither of us was looking for. James felt as though the ground beneath him had shifted. For 3 years, he'd convinced himself he didn't need anyone, that he and the boys were better off alone, but Nora had walked into their lives and shown him how incomplete they had been. I have, he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. Felt it, I mean, but I'm afraid, Nora. I lost someone once and it nearly broke me, the thought of risking that again. Life offers no guarantees, James, she said softly, but it does offer possibilities if we're brave enough to reach for them. She was standing close to him now, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she used. When Cooper told me you'd be leaving in a week, I felt like I was losing something I never knew I wanted, James confessed. The boys were right. I don't want you to go. Nora's eyes widened with hope. What are you saying, James? I'm saying that maybe the boys aren't the only ones who want you to stay. He reached out tentatively, taking her hand in his. I'm not ready to make promises yet, and you deserve more than half a man still haunted by his past. But if you were willing to give us time, time is exactly what I'm asking for, she interrupted, her fingers tightening around his. Time to see if what we've started here could grow into something more. The town hired you to be their teacher, not my housekeeper, James pointed out. They'd expect you to live in town to be proper. I could still teach, Nora said thoughtfully, but perhaps we could find a compromise. I could stay in town during the week and come here on weekends, to help with the boys' additional studies, of course. Of course, James agreed, a slow smile spreading across his face. Very educational. Purely professional, Nora added, her own lips curving upward. The town gossips would have a field day. Let them talk, we'd know the truth. James looked down at their joined hands, marveling at how right it felt. And what is the truth, Nora Bellamy? She met his gaze steadily. The truth is that I came west looking for a new beginning, and I think I found it not just in a job or a town, but in a family that needs me as much as I need them. James felt a weight lifting from his shoulders, a burden he'd carried for so long he'd forgotten what it was like to stand straight. The boys will be insufferable when they find out they were right. Nora laughed, the sound warming him from within. We'll manage them together. The next morning, James woke to the familiar smell of coffee and the sound of Nora moving about the kitchen. He dressed quickly and found her at the stove, her hair in its usual braid, humming softly as she worked. Good morning, he said, accepting the cup she offered him. Good morning. Her smile held a new warmth, a shared secret. I thought we might tell the boys at breakfast. About the weekend arrangement, I mean, James nodded. They'll still be disappointed you're leaving at all, but it's a start. When the twins tumbled out of their bedroom a short while later, they immediately sensed something had changed. They looked from their father to Nora and back again with suspicious eyes. What's going on? Billy asked. You're both smiling funny. We have some news, James said, gesturing for them to sit at the table. Miss Nora and I have been talking about what will happen when the teacherage is ready. The boys' faces fell immediately. We don't want her to go, Thomas said defiantly. We know, Nora said gently, and I don't really want to go either, so we've come up with a plan. What kind of plan? Billy asked cautiously, hope beginning to dawn in his eyes. I'll still move to town and teach at the school, Nora explained. That's my job and I'm committed to it. But on Friday afternoons after school, your father will come to town to bring me back here for the weekends. Really? Thomas exclaimed. Every weekend, James confirmed. Miss Nora will stay here with us until Sunday evening when I'll take her back to town for the school week. For how long? Billy asked shrewdly. Forever, James and Nora exchanged a glance. For now, James said carefully, we're taking things one step at a time, but if things go well. If things go well, Nora continued, then maybe someday we'll talk about a more permanent arrangement. The boys were silent for a moment, processing this information. Then Billy spoke up. Does that mean you might marry Pa after all? William, James warned, but his tone lacked real reproach. It means, Nora said diplomatically, that your father and I care about each other and want to see where this journey takes us, and we both care very much about you boys. This seemed to satisfy them. Thomas turned to his brother with a triumphant grin. Told you they liked each other. I told you first, Billy argued. Did not. Did too. James caught Nora's eye over the boys' bickering heads, and they shared a smile that held promises of future mornings just like this one, full of noise and love and the comfortable chaos of family. 6 months later, on a crisp autumn day, James stood nervously in the small church in Timber Creek, his sons beside him in new suits, waiting for the doors to open. The townspeople filled the pews, many of them the parents of Nora's students who had come to adore their dedicated teacher. The weekend arrangement had worked well better than either James or Nora had dared to hope. Each Friday, the boys would wait impatiently for their father to return from town with Nora, and the four of them would spend blissful weekends together, strengthening the bonds that had begun to form during that first fortuitous 2 weeks. By the 3rd month, James had found the courage to ask Nora to marry him, offering her not just his heart but a permanent place in their family. Her joyful acceptance had led to this day, with the boys practically bouncing with excitement as they waited to officially welcome Nora as their mother. When the doors opened and Nora appeared in a simple but elegant white dress, a crown of autumn flowers in her hair, James felt his breath catch. She walked toward him with sure steps, her eyes never leaving his, and he marveled at how this woman, this strong, kind, remarkable woman, had chosen him and his boys, had chosen to make their broken family whole again. I told you so, Billy whispered loudly as Nora reached them, causing laughter to ripple through the congregation. Hush, you, James murmured, but he was smiling too widely to be stern. As they spoke their vows, promising to love and cherish each other for all their days, James reflected on how thoroughly his conviction that he didn't need a woman in his life had been upended. It had taken his son's innocent question, when is she coming back? To make him realize what he'd been missing, what they'd all been missing. That night, after the celebration and after the boys had finally fallen asleep, exhausted by the excitement of the day, James found his new wife standing on the porch of what was now truly their home. Happy. He asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. Nora leaned back against him, sighing contentedly. Completely, and you, more than I ever thought possible. He pressed a kiss to her temple. Thank you for not giving up on us, on me. Never. She turned in his arms to face him. You know, when I first arrived and you were so determined to manage on your own, I wasn't sure there was a place for me here. There's always been a place for you here, James said softly. I just didn't know it until the boys showed me. Nora laughed. They're going to hold that over us forever, you know. Remember when we had to tell Pa he needed to marry the teacher? Worth it, James declared, drawing her closer. Every teasing remark, every I told you so, all of it worth it to have you here where you belong. As they stood together under the vast Wyoming sky, James O'Malley, who once claimed he didn't need a woman, silently thanked his sons for their wisdom and the fates for sending Nora Bellamy to their door. Some lessons, he had learned, were worth admitting you were wrong about. Especially when being wrong led to something so perfectly, wonderfully right.